0630. Picture this. You are sealed inside a classification vault 3 kilometers beneath the surface of a dying star's archive shell. The air is thin and cold because the room was never designed for breathing creatures. It was designed for crystalline memory, for stillness, for the slow, eternal work of cataloging what civilizations choose to remember about themselves. Senior catalog keeper Iridal vom Sorath has not left this chamber in 9 standard days. Her crystalline memory organs are fracturing along the edges from overuse. In front of her, suspended in a containment field the size of a child's coffin, floats a single data cube containing the submitted history of a species called humanity. The cube is rewriting itself. Not corrupting, not glitching, rewriting. For the 847th time since acquisition, the internal structure of the archive has reorganized its own contents into a new configuration. Iridal has watched the same atrocity become a triumph, become a tragedy, become a footnote, become a founding myth. She has watched the same human being indexed as a saint, a tyrant, a liberator, and a war criminal across 4 consecutive scans. She is screaming now, not loudly. The VTHRI do not scream loudly. They release a low harmonic vibration through their throat membranes that the rest of the staff have learned to recognize as professional catastrophe. The Concordant Library of Othenmore has classified 14,000 sapient civilizations across 400,000 standard years. It has never, in its entire operational history, failed to assign a species to category. Until now. Until this small, loud, contradiction-soaked species from a blue planet in an unremarkable spiral arm submitted their complete unedited history and broke the most sophisticated archival system in the known galaxy. The official inquiry that will eventually be opened by the High Classification Council will produce documents that are themselves filed under a new category created specifically to contain them. How does a library that has organized the memory of 14,000 civilizations fail to shelve one? Before we descend into this story together, if you find yourself drawn to forgotten corners of cosmic history, consider hitting that subscribe button. Drop a comment below telling me where in the galaxy you are listening from. There is something remarkable about strangers gathering across distance to study the strange shapes that civilizations leave behind. To understand how a single species shattered the library, you have to understand what the library actually was. The Concordant Library of Othenmore was not a building. It was an institution wrapped around a dying star, a Dyson shell archive constructed by a coalition of ancient species who had agreed, 400,000 standard years ago, that the galaxy needed one neutral place to hold the official history of every civilization that joined the galactic community. Think of it as a cosmic version of a national archive, except the nation in question is the entire galaxy, and the archivists are functionally immortal. Every species applying for galactic membership submitted their complete historical record for classification. The library then assigned that species to one of 4 foundational categories. Conqueror civilizations were those whose history was defined by expansion and dominance. Harmonious civilizations were those whose history centered on cooperation and stability. Tragic civilizations were those whose history culminated in collapse or near extinction. Failed civilizations were those whose history terminated entirely. Every species fits somewhere. The categories were broad enough to accommodate nuance but firm enough to enable comparison. I find it genuinely beautiful how convinced the Council was of its own neutrality. They believed the categories described reality. They did not understand that the categories had been gently shaping reality for 400,000 years. Every species submitting their history knew which category they wanted to land in. They edited accordingly. They softened their conquests, polished their cooperative phases, mourned their tragedies in poetic terms. The library received submissions that were already pre-curated by the submitting species' own sense of dignity. The library mistook this dignity for honesty. Iridal vom Sorath had spent 240 standard years working the acquisitions desk. She had personally classified 87 new species. She had never seen a submission that resisted classification. She had also, like every other archivist on staff, never once thought to ask whether the things being submitted were actually true. Humanity was discovered by the Athari survey fleet in what humans called the year 2387. The first contact protocol was standard. The survey captain delivered the welcome address, explained the galactic community, and presented humanity with the standard membership package. The package required submission of a complete historical archive for classification. Humanity was given 2 standard years to prepare their submission. This was where the Council expected the usual pattern. Young species typically panicked at this stage. They scrambled to organize their records. They debated internally about which version of their history to send. They sometimes requested extensions. They almost always asked, through diplomatic channels, what kind of submission tended to be best received. The Council had a polite scripted answer that gently suggested coherent narratives were appreciated. Humanity asked no such questions. The human delegation, led by a soft-spoken negotiator named Marcus Hadley, simply asked how much storage capacity the library could allocate to a single submission. The Athari liaison answered, slightly amused, that the library could accommodate any volume of data the species cared to provide. Marcus Hadley thanked them politely and went home to Earth. 18 standard months later, humanity submitted 847 zettabytes of unfiltered archival data. The transmission took 6 standard weeks to complete. The library's intake systems, which were calibrated to handle the largest civilizational submissions on record, briefly seized. The previous record holder, the VTHRE themselves, had submitted 42 zettabytes. Humanity exceeded that by a factor of 20. The Council assumed this was either a transmission error or an arrogant young species padding their record to seem impressive. Then the archivists began reading. The data was not padded, it was not redundant, it was simply complete. Humanity had submitted everything, every war, every famine, every betrayal, every act of mercy, every named saint and every named monster, every disputed history, every revisionist counter-history, every confession, every accusation, every recantation. They had submitted their religious texts and the academic critiques of those texts. They had submitted their national myths and the documents proving those myths were false. They had submitted court records from genocides and the personal diaries of the people who committed them. They had submitted love letters and execution orders from the same individuals. I read the initial intake report 3 separate times when I first encountered this case in our training archives. The phrase that lodged in my mind was written by a junior cataloger who flagged the submission for senior review. She wrote, with what I can only describe as quiet terror, that the humans appeared to have submitted their history without removing anything, without softening anything, without curating anything. The Council assumed, charitably, that the humans had not yet learned how submissions were supposed to work. They assigned Iridal Vomsoreth to handle classification personally, expecting her experienced hand to find the appropriate category and quietly tidy up the messier portions of the record. Iridal began with the Conqueror category. The case for it was strong at first glance. Humans had a documented history of empire building stretching back tens of thousands of years. They had subjugated their own species repeatedly. They had crossed oceans and continents in search of conquest. They had named their conquerors with pride: Caesar, Genghis, Napoleon. The pattern was textbook. The classification triggered an error within 43 minutes. Error 7714. Subject contradicts itself across temporal axis. The same species that produced Caesar also produced the Treaty of Westphalia. The same culture that built empires also built the United Nations. The same humans who colonized also decolonized. The same nation that dropped atomic weapons also led the global nonproliferation effort. Iridal could not in good conscience file humanity as a conqueror civilization when their own archive contained, in equal volume, the documented work of dismantling their conquests. She tried harmonious next. The case for this was also strong. Humans had built the largest cooperative institutions in galactic history relative to their developmental stage. They had created international law. They had eradicated diseases. They had fed their poor across borders during their own famines. They had built libraries, universities, hospitals open to all. The pattern was clear. Error 7714 fired again at the 11-minute mark. The same species that built the World Health Organization had also conducted the Tuskegee experiments. The same culture that wrote the Geneva Conventions had also produced the architects of Rwanda. The harmonious category required a baseline of cooperative behavior that did not coexist with documented industrial-scale cruelty. Humanity coexisted with itself. Tragic was the third attempt. Surely a species that had endured the Black Death, 2 world wars, multiple genocides, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation qualified as tragic. Irrital ran the classification with something approaching relief. The error this time took only 9 minutes. Tragic civilizations were defined by a downward arc, by the weight of suffering accumulating toward collapse. Humans, inexplicably, kept producing comedy. They had written jokes during their plagues. They had filmed musicals during their world wars. They had built theme parks within walking distance of their concentration camp memorials. The tragic category could not accommodate a species that insisted on laughing through its own apocalypse. Failed was the final foundational category, and Irrital did not even attempt it. Humans were demonstrably not failed. They were standing in her intake hall as she classified them. They had built starships. They were drinking the library's ceremonial water with apparent enjoyment. She filed an exception request with the Council. The exception request itself generated 3 new error codes. Irrital had never before in her career generated a single error code. She generated 9 that morning. The Council descended on the Terran Acquisitions desk within 2 standard days. Senior Council members did not normally involve themselves with individual classifications. The library handled thousands of submissions across a generation, and most were resolved at the junior level. The personal arrival of 3 Council members signaled that something was being treated as a potential institutional crisis. Chief Classifier Vandrin Allaspel led the intervention. Vandrin was 9,000 standard years old. He had personally written the addendum to the foundational taxonomy 3,000 years ago, when a particularly slippery species had required new subcategorization. He arrived at Irrital's chamber radiating the calm condescension of a senior administrator who has come to fix a problem that should not exist. Vandrin ordered Irrital to step aside. He examined the human submission for 2 hours. He attempted Conqueror Variant 3, the subcategory used for species whose conquests had been morally complex. The submission generated error 7714 plus a new error, 7715, which the system had never produced before. He attempted Harmonious Variant 7, used for species whose cooperation had been built atop earlier violence. Error 7714 fired again, this time accompanied by what the technicians later described as a low harmonic groan emerging from the classification engine itself. He attempted increasingly obscure subcategories that had not been deployed in millennia. Tragic Variant 12, for species whose suffering had produced enlightenment. Conqueror Variant 9, for species whose dominance had been self-limiting. Harmonious Variant 2, for species whose cooperation had been built on unspoken cruelty. Each attempt produced a fresh error. By the end of the second day, the system was generating error codes that did not have names yet. Error 8001. Error 8002. Error 8003. I want you to understand how unprecedented this was. The library's classification engine had been operating continuously for 400,000 years. Its error catalog had been comprehensive for the last 390,000. Generating new error codes was something that had simply not happened within institutional memory. The technicians on duty, began documenting each new era with the reverence of paleontologists discovering new species. Vandren did the only thing left available to a senior council member. He summoned the human delegation and politely requested that they resubmit a cleaner version of their archive. He explained, with the careful diplomatic language reserved for moments of genuine institutional embarrassment, that the original submission appeared to contain internal contradictions that were preventing classification. He suggested that humanity might wish to review their archive and perhaps consolidate it around a clearer thematic structure. Marcus Hadley listened to this request with the patient attention of a man who has sat through many similar conversations. He was a small human by the standards of his species, with gray hair and tired eyes, and the bearing of someone who has spent his entire career explaining humanity to people who did not want to understand it. When Vandren finished, Marcus said only one thing. He said that humanity had submitted everything intentionally. He said that any version of their history without the contradictions would not be their history. He said that the library was welcome to classify them or not classify them, but that humanity would not be editing their archive to fit the available categories. Then he stood up, thanked Vandren for his time, and left the chamber. Vandren stood in stunned silence for a full minute. In 9,000 years, no species had ever refused to revise a submission. The council had assumed, from the beginning, that the offer to be classified was so valuable that species would shape themselves to receive it. Humanity, apparently, did not consider classification valuable enough to lie for. This was the moment when the case stopped being a classification problem and started being something else, something the library did not yet have a name for. Vandren returned to his private chamber and accessed the deep archives. There existed, locked behind 19 layers of authorization, a classification method that had been formally abandoned 80,000 standard years ago. It was called comparative mirror analysis, and it worked by searching the library's complete archive for the historical analog that most closely resembled the species under review. If a new submission could not be classified directly, mirror analysis could find its closest match among already classified species, and the new submission could inherit the classification of its mirror. The method had been abandoned because it occasionally produced uncomfortable results. Species sometimes discovered they resembled civilizations they had been at war with, or civilizations they had previously dismissed as primitive. The council had retired the method in favor of direct classification. Vandren reactivated it in desperation. The mirror analysis ran for 9 standard days. The library's full computational capacity was diverted to the search. Other classifications were suspended. Junior archivists were sent home. Vandren and Iridal sat together in the analysis chamber, watching the search expand outward through the deep archives, scanning every cataloged civilization for resonance with the human pattern. On the 9th day, the search returned its result. The result was a single line of text on a single screen, in the formal archival script that the library used for official findings. No matches found across all available archives. Iridal read the line 3 times. Vandren read it once and then read it again, his crystalline organs flickering with what I have to describe as something close to fear. The library held the complete histories of 14,000 civilizations. The mirror analysis had searched every one of them. Humanity resembled none of them. I want to be precise about what this meant. It did not mean humanity was unique in the sentimental sense that every species likes to believe about itself. It meant that the actual structural pattern of humanity's history did not match any other recorded pattern. The shape of their archive was new. Iridal began, in that moment, to do something she had never done in her 240-year career. She stopped trying to classify humanity. She started reading them. She read for 31 standard days. She did not leave the chamber. She did not sleep, in the limited sense that her species sleeps. She consumed the human archive in the order they had submitted it, which was not chronological but emotional. Organized by themes, the humans had assigned that the library's intake system had never seen before. Themes like reckonings. Themes like things we did not want to remember but recorded anyway. Themes like apologies. Themes like acknowledgments of harm. It was in the acknowledgments of harm folder that Iridal finally understood what she was looking at. Humans had, in their archive, a subcategory dedicated to formal admissions of wrongdoing by their own institutions. Governments apologizing to indigenous peoples. Churches apologizing to abuse victims. Universities apologizing for collaborating with eugenics. Corporations apologizing for slavery. Nations apologizing to other nations. The folder contained tens of thousands of these documents. They were not propaganda. They were not deflections. They were specific, dated, signed admissions that something terrible had been done, and that the institution doing the admitting had been responsible. Iridal cross-referenced this folder against the archives of other classified civilizations. She searched the Athari archive first. The Athari were a harmonious civilization, beloved across the galaxy for their cooperative philosophy. Iridal searched their archive for any equivalent folder. She found nothing. She searched for any record of the Athari slave era, which she knew from external sources had lasted 3,000 years. The Athari archive contained no mention of it. Their slave era had been quietly removed from the official record some 60,000 years ago. She searched the Quarn archive next. The Quarn were tragic, classified that way after their religious wars had nearly extinguished them. Iridal searched for the Quarn equivalent of acknowledgments of harm. She found a curated selection of poetry mourning the dead. She found nothing identifying the perpetrators. The Quarn religious wars had been archived, but the names of the people who had ordered the massacres had been removed. She searched her own archive. The Vthari were also harmonious. Iridal knew, from family memory passed down through her crystalline lineage, that the Vthari had committed 3 planetary genocides during their expansion phase. She searched the official archive for any record of these genocides. She found references to those 3 planets being absorbed into Vthari space. She found no record of the populations that had been living there. The Vthari had erased their own genocides, not maliciously, not even consciously in the recent generations. They had simply, over thousands of years, allowed those records to fade from the official archive because keeping them felt inconsistent with the harmonious classification the library had given them. This was the pattern. Every civilization in the library had edited itself to fit its category. The categories had not described the species. The species had reshaped themselves to be describable. Humans were the only ones who had refused. Iridal sat in her chamber on the 32nd day and understood, for the first time in 240 years, that the library had not been classifying truths. It had been classifying the polished surfaces that civilizations chose to show. The 400,000-year-old taxonomy was not a record of what species were. It was a record of what species had been willing to admit about themselves. And humanity had submitted, alone among 14,000 civilizations, the unpolished version. Iridal brought her findings to Vandran on the 33rd day. She did not present them as an accusation. She presented them as a classification problem. She said that humanity could not be classified within the existing taxonomy because the existing taxonomy required a level of historical curation that humanity had refused to perform. She said that classifying humanity would require either creating a new category, which would invalidate the library's foundational claim of completeness, or rejecting humanity's submission, which would require the library to admit that its categories did not describe reality. She said, more quietly, that there was a third option. The library could ask every previously classified civilization to resubmit their archives without curation. The library could be honest, for the first time in 400,000 years, about what it actually was. Vandren listened to this without interrupting. When Iridal finished, he was silent for a long time. He did not look at her. He looked at the wall of the chamber, at the patterns of light that crossed the ancient stone, at the 400,000 years of institutional weight pressing down on his shoulders. He told her, finally, that what she was proposing would destroy the library. He told her that if the library admitted its categories were polite fictions, every civilization in the galactic community would have to confront the gap between what they were and what they had claimed to be. He told her that some of those civilizations would not survive the confrontation. He told her that the Athari would face the return of their slave era. The Quarn would face the named perpetrators of their religious wars. The Vthari would face their genocides. He told her, very softly, that the library existed in part to prevent this, that the categories were a mercy, that every civilization needed a story it could tell about itself in order to keep functioning, and that the library's role was to validate that story. Iridal asked him, equally softly, what the library was supposed to do with humanity then, a species that had already faced its gaps, a species that did not need the mercy. Vandren did not answer. He went to his private chamber that night and authored an order. The order instructed Iridal to mark the human archive classification impossible, quarantine indefinite. This designation existed in the library's protocols but had never been used. It would functionally seal humanity's submission, remove it from active processing, and prevent any further classification attempts. It would also, as a side effect, deny humanity full galactic membership. Quarantined species existed in a permanent diplomatic limbo. Iridal received the order on the 34th day. She read it once. She set it on her desk. She did not execute it. She walked instead to the diplomatic chamber where Marcus Hadley was still waiting for the library's decision. He had been waiting for 34 days. He had not complained. He had not requested updates. He had simply sat in the visitors' lounge each morning, reading what appeared to be a small physical book, and gone home to the Terran delegation's quarters each evening. Iridal told him about Vandren's order. She told him about the mirror analysis. She told him about the missing folders in every other civilization's archive. She told him what humanity's submission had revealed about the library itself. Marcus listened. When she was done, he closed his book and looked at her for a long moment. He said one thing. He said, "We are not asking you to forgive us. We are asking you to file us." Iridal returned to her chamber and did not execute Vandren's order. She filed a formal counterpetition with the full council, requesting an emergency review of the human classification case and attaching her findings on archival curation across all classified civilizations. The petition fractured the council. 3 members supported Vandren. 3 members supported Iridal. The deciding member, an ancient archivist named Solon Vairahad, who had been with the library since its founding generation, took 6 standard days to deliberate. During those 6 days, no classifications were processed anywhere in the library. The institution held its breath. On the 7th day, Solon delivered her decision. She did not rule in favor of Vandren. She did not rule in favor of Iridal. She did something stranger and more permanent. She ruled that humanity could not be classified within the existing taxonomy, that the existing taxonomy was insufficient, and that the library would not be creating a new category to accommodate humanity, because doing so would imply that humanity was an exception. Humanity was not an exception. Humanity was a demonstration. She ordered the construction of a new wing. Not a section, not a sub-archive, an entire new architectural addition to the library, built outward from the original Dyson shell, large enough to hold humanity's submission in its complete uncurated form. The wing would not be labeled with a category. It would be labeled only with a question mark. The question mark would mean, officially this has not been classified. It would mean, unofficially, this is what history looks like when nothing is removed. Construction began within the standard month. The new wing took 2 standard years to complete. During those 2 years, something remarkable happened in the galactic community. Civilizations began requesting permission to resubmit their archives. The Athari came first. They submitted with quiet dignity the complete record of their 3,000-year slave era. They asked to be reclassified. The Council did not reclassify them. The Council added their resubmission to the new wing, alongside humanity's. The Quarn came second. They submitted the names of the people who had ordered the religious massacres. Their poetry of mourning, previously the only record of those wars, was now accompanied by the documented record of the perpetrators. The Quarn were not reclassified either. They joined humanity in the new wing. The VTHRE were last. Iridal personally led the resubmission process for her own species. She traveled home to the VTHRE archive worlds and worked for 11 standard years to reconstruct the records of the 3 planetary genocides her people had erased. She found witness testimony in private family archives. She found administrative records in the financial systems of the colonizing generation. She found, in one case, a single surviving descendant of one of the extinguished populations, living quietly on a VTHRE world, who had been keeping her people's memory alive through 8,000 years of silence. Iridal submitted all of it to the new wing. The new wing now holds the resubmitted archives of 243 civilizations. The original classified taxonomy still exists. The library still uses it for incoming species. But the new wing has become, quietly, the most visited section of the entire archive. Diplomats come to study it. Young archivists come to train in it. Species considering submission come to walk through it before deciding what to submit. I have been working in the new wing for the last 40 standard years. I am writing this account as part of the official record. I want to be honest about what I have learned, because honesty appears to be the only thing this wing requires of those who enter it. I have learned that the library was wrong for 400,000 years, not maliciously, not even consciously. It was wrong because it built a system that mistook polish for truth, and the system was so well built that it convinced every civilization that participated in it that polish was what dignity required. I have learned that humans did not break the library through strength. They did not conquer it. They did not outsmart it. They broke it by refusing to participate in the lie. They submitted what they were in full and let the institution decide what to do with the submission. The institution could not classify them, so the institution had to change. I have learned, watching humans walk through the new wing, that they do not visit it with pride. They do not visit it with shame either. They visit it with recognition. They look at their own atrocities filed beside their own triumphs and they nod, the way a person nods when they see an old photograph of themselves, and accept that the person in the photograph is them. This is the part the rest of us are still learning. The galactic community spent 400,000 years protecting its civilizations from their own histories. We thought we were being kind. We thought we were giving everyone a story they could live with. We did not understand that the story we were validating was a story that required constant editing, constant erasure, constant quiet maintenance to keep functioning. We did not understand how exhausting it is to be a civilization that cannot look at itself. Humans understood. They had learned it the hard way, on their small, loud planet, over thousands of years of trying to bury their own crimes, and finding that the crimes did not stay buried. They had learned that the only way to be at peace with what you are is to admit what you are. The folder of acknowledgments of harm was not a confession. It was an architecture, a structural feature of a civilization that had decided to remain standing by refusing to pretend it had not done what it had done. The library is different now because of them. I want to close this account with the moment I think about most often. It happened in the 2nd year after the new wing opened. Marcus Hadley, the human ambassador, came back to visit. He was older. He had retired from diplomatic service. He came as a private citizen. He walked through the new wing alone for several hours. I followed him at a respectful distance because he was the reason any of this had happened, and I wanted to see what he would do. He stopped at a small display case containing the names of the populations the VTHRE had extinguished. He stood there for a long time. I had submitted those names myself. There were 143,000 of them. He read every single one. It took him most of the afternoon. When he was done, he turned to me. He did not say anything profound. He did not deliver a speech. He just nodded the way I had seen humans nod at their own archives. He said, "Thank you for filing them." Then he walked out of the wing and went home. I think about that often. I think about how strange it is that a species we could not classify taught us how to keep records. I think about how the library spent 400,000 years believing it was a place of memory, when in fact it had been, for most of that time, a place of careful forgetting. I think about how the new wing exists because one species refused to forget on our behalf. Thank you for sitting with this account. If something in it shifted the way you think about how civilizations remember themselves, please consider hitting that subscribe button. The next account I want to share with you concerns a species that submitted only their music and what we learned from the silence between the notes. Drop a comment below telling me which civilization in the new wing you would most like to walk through, and I will see you in the next chapter of the archive.